Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to the CHP podcast. I am your host, Ariana Scalfo. I am the director of coaching of CHP and also the director of talking on our podcast. Today I have with me Susan Lopez. She is super awesome. We met her through a client of Alex's, and she just has the coolest job, the coolest experience, and I think a really, really solid outlook on nutrition for tactical athletes. So her name on Instagram is Tactical Dietitian. And I think because CHP works with so many tactical athletes, military athletes, and things like that, that I think they're the OG hybrids, basically. It's really cool to hear from Susan about her experience working as a tactical performance dietitian in the military, because I think a lot of the principles that she uses with her athletes would carry over perfectly over into hybrid training in general and some of the really, really crazy stuff us crazy folks put ourselves through. So I'm super honored to have her on the podcast today. Susan, welcome. Hi. If I messed up anything in your introduction or you want to go over anything else about yourself, feel free to clean the slate now.
No, that was perfect. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Cool. The thing that I'm most curious about is, coming from your background, which I don't know, how did you end up in this such a niche space, right? Like this is about as niche as it niches. How did you end up here? And what kind of drew you to it, I suppose?
So it really happened by accident. I am from a small town in the Midwest, and if anybody has any exposure to the military, has joined the military or anything like that, you know how they do things. Like the recruiter shows up and they're like, come join the military. We'll show you the world and you'll get paid. And when you're living in a town that is so small that you essentially do your entire kindergarten, grade school, middle school, and high school on the same block, that sounds amazing. And so there's a typical story, right? Recruiter comes in, and I fell into a job that I really didn't know what it was, but it ended up being something called nutrition care. And so, nutrition care technicians for the Army, essentially what they are is they're glorified hospital cooks. So, I was a military cook for a little over 6 years, almost 7 years. From 2000 to 2007, I was on active duty in the military. And I loved it. I had some crazy experiences that I didn't realize would be unique, right? So I was in the military during the early years of the GWAT, and I deployed a couple of times with the unit I was with. And I really look fondly back on those memories. And by the time I left the military, I knew that I wanted to work in nutrition. So I worked as a military cook. I worked as a military cook in the hospital. And then I also worked in that position. I got to work with some really amazing dietitians in the military who took me under their wing and really showed me the ropes. And so I was sold by the time I got out. Got out of the military, ended up moving to Texas, did my undergrad there in nutrition, did my internship there, became a dietitian. But by that time, I already had a family. When I left the military, I was married and then had a child shortly after that. Finished school, became a dietitian. So I couldn't work like the traditional dietitian jobs, sports dietitian jobs. A lot of dietitians will go into college athletics and then maybe pro athletics. And that's really all that there was at that time for sports dietitians. And I knew that I wanted to eventually come back, work for the military as a sports dietitian, but not wear the green suit anymore. And like I wanted all the benefits without any of like some of the BS and politics that come with that. But I loved the military. And so at this time, unbeknownst to me, this was when special operations was starting to stand up their human performance programs. And I worked as a civilian dietitian in a lot of different places. I worked in fitness. I worked as a personal trainer and dietitian for a short time. I did get to work for a local city municipality. So that's really where I got my first taste of working with police officers, firefighters, and that side of the tactical house. Did a short stint in clinical management. And then when the Army's H2F program was stood up, I applied for the pilot and was accepted onto that. And so had finally come full circle to fulfill my dream of working for the military as a civilian dietitian in human performance. And shortly after that, I was then accepted into a position in special operations, and have been doing that ever since. And I just love it. Um, I think coming from the military, but then also being married to a special operations service member has, and then working in special operations, I always joke with people. I'm like, I was educated by the military. I was in the military. My parents actually served for a short time in the military. I'm married to it. I work for it. Like I just can't get away from it. I don't know how to do anything else.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's kind of like, I guess, the long version of how I came around to be a tactical dietitian.
I think that's brilliant. You basically were like in the military making the food, and then you were like, wait a minute, I want to be the one telling people what to make, basically. So I'm going to go build this giant career path and then
Yeah,
come back and be the person. Like you became the person.
yeah.
I think that's so cool.
Yeah. I always like to tell myself that I manifested my job.
I think you worked
But
your
I
butt
think
off
really
for
just, yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you.
it.
It was tough. It was tough.
Yeah.
My family's not a super educated family. And so I was the first one to actually not only graduate high school, but then attend higher education, and then later on go on to get, my graduate degree as well. So that was a huge accomplishment. My family is, they were supportive, and my husband's always been supportive. So that was really awesome.
Yeah. It's really cool. I think when you, just speaking as a person who has also come from a small town and a family that, I mean, neither of my parents graduated college. Um, it's it's kind of a different thing because you don't have, unless you have a really good guidance counselor or you have a really cool network of people who have been through higher education, um, you don't realize how many avenues are available to you when you are in that place, in that small town. I just remember, the degree that I chose was art because I thought, okay, well, I'm chronically ill. There's no reason for me to do exercise science. I don't even exercise. I was super interested in it. That's what I wanted to do. But I was like, oh, well, I'm not good at it. So I shouldn't go to school for it. And everyone around me was like, well, yeah, you might struggle in the science classes. So maybe just do something comfortable. Um, and now that I have been in the field for so long, I've spoken to so many people that were like, yeah, I went to school for it and I figured it out. And I'm like, oh man, like I wish someone had just been like, no, like go do it. Go push yourself. Go take that risk. Okay, you're going to struggle in the science classes. So does everybody. Like,
Yeah.
welcome. Um, I just think it's really cool
Uh,
when I speak to other people who just kind of like do the darn thing, even though no one is giving you a career path. You just figured it out.
And I will tell you that I have never cried harder than when I took some of my science classes. You know,
Hmm.
I like there were some classes where I went to the lecture, I went to the complementary labs or supplementary labs,
Yeah.
and I had a tutor, and it was rough. There was definitely times where I was like, I'm not going to make it through this class, and my whole life is a lie, and
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
And then
you
magically,
definitely go through those.
you do it. You make it happen.
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I've always found that really, really cool. Because yeah, I do. I not that I don't want to use the word privilege, but it definitely is a different mindset when you are in a family of people who've pursued higher education and have higher level jobs and have gone through either academia or any job really where they've worked up through the ranks. There's always this sort of like, oh yeah, you can go do whatever you want. And also here's how you can start, and you've watched it happen, and you have confidence. And when you're coming from a background of everyone around you is they're working their butts off, but there's always this kind of like intangible quality to it where you're like, I guess I'm just going to take the next best thing, the next best thing, the next best thing. And then if you stay focused like you did, obviously you end up where you want it to be. But you kind of have to be open to, like you said, working as a personal trainer and then working in clinic. And then like you worked everywhere.
Yeah, bounced around a lot. I mean, my dad is a laborer. When he left the military, he went back to work as a farmhand and a metal worker.
And good, thank God for him, right? Because we wouldn't have
Yeah,
food and we wouldn't have anything like a super valuable member of society. But for you, it's like,
absolutely.
how do I become a registered dietitian? And he's like, work really hard.
Maybe you should just be a plumber. Maybe you
Yeah,
should just be a plumber. Oh,
yeah,
well, they do make a lot of money.
they sure do. That's one of the things I always tell people, because I'm sure you experience this too. When you work in nutrition, people will they'll talk badly about themselves. They'll be like, oh, well, I didn't know that. Oh, I was stupid, or I don't know food, or I don't know nutrition. And they'll downplay their own knowledge. And I'll be like, hey, I couldn't do your job for 3 seconds. We all have our thing. Like, we all picked our expertise. Every time a plumber comes into my home, every time a laborer comes into my home, I am so respectful, because if that man did not exist, that woman did not exist, I'd be screwed. Like, no amount of YouTube could get me through that. Like, I don't know how to fix a car, but I drive
Yeah.
one. Like, so again, like, everyone has their expertise. And for us, we obviously got obsessed with nutrition, but not knowing everything about nutrition does not make you a bad human being. It just means that you picked something else that I probably can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting how the focus has gone from like, you know, we have all these college educated people right now, but we don't have enough tradesmen.
Hmm.
And so it's funny, my family encouraged me to go to college. And me, I'm telling my daughter, if you don't want to go to college, like that's okay.
Yeah,
Like look at
go get into welding.
yeah, go get a trade. Go travel for a year and figure out what you want to do with your life.
Mhm,
Like, you don't have to go to college,
mhm.
right? You just have to want to do something with your life that's meaningful to you, but then is also, I think, meaningful to society,
Yeah.
right? And I think, and this is probably why I love the military so much, especially special operations, is because there's just a desire to be a part of something greater than yourself and contribute to something greater than yourself, um, and to always kind of want to be a part of the bigger community, as it were. And and so I think those values are something that I want to emulate professionally, but I also want to emulate personally
Yeah.
as well.
Mhm.
And so I think that's why, like, at least in our family, the military has had such a huge impact on our life, and we've felt called to it, you know. And I think that's part of the reason why I worked so hard to get to that point, is I wanted to still be part of that community, but I wanted to do it in my own way,
Yeah.
and in a way that I felt was going to be more impactful.
Mhm. Yeah, like you were in the system, saw a need, left the system, came back, filled the need.
Yeah.
That's
And I've
awesome.
been fortunate to be able to stay in that role for some time now. And I mean, um, it doesn't feel like work to me. And
That's
I think that's
brilliant.
a blessing,
Yeah. Yeah. So speaking of work, what does it look like to be a tactical performance dietitian? So like what what does your day-to-day look like? And then is there sort of an overarching um, focus that you have throughout months or years? Kind of what do you do in your role, and how do you help the people that you work with?
Yeah. There's some level of predictability in the job for sure, because you do need to be available and be able to be found when guys are looking for you. So um, I do spend a good portion of my morning in our rehabilitation clinic working with guys who've been injured. And uh, typically in the military, in the morning time is when most guys are training in the gym. They're doing most of their physical activity. And so being kind of in a small area between the rehab clinic and the gym is where you can typically find me.
Mm-hmm.
It's just easy for me to be accessible. The guys know where I'm at. They have questions. They can just pop by for 5 minutes. Somebody's coming in for rehabilitation. I can just get a warm handoff from the physical therapists and athletic trainers that I work with and provide some type of nutrition intervention on the spot, which, a lot of dietitians working in, let's say, outpatient services will typically do like one-on-one appointments that are scheduled weeks ahead of time. And it just doesn't work that way in a really dynamic environment in the tactical field. You have to be adaptable and adjust your schedule accordingly, and be willing to just take like last minute questions, on the spot appointments. Um, I don't personally, in the way that I run my clinic, so to speak, I don't feel like it's necessary to always schedule things weeks out ahead of time. These guys, they have unpredictable schedules.
Yeah.
And so I have to be willing to bend and flex with that. My morning times, though, it's pretty easy to find me. Um, what I love about the job is being able to practice performance nutrition outside of a sit down office environment,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, you might find me on an obstacle course. You might find me at a shooting range.
Yeah.
You, like you might find me standing in the dirt on the side of a road during a 12-mile ruck march, right? Just making sure that the guys are coming through, have what they need in terms of hydration, fueling, or just being a familiar face on the path
Mm-hmm.
that I'm like, hey, I'm out here, I'm supporting you. I'm not an operator. I'll never be an operator, but being willing to be uncomfortable in some ways with these guys does go a long way as far as building trust. And so that's one of the things that I love about the job is I don't have to work from an office, you know?
Yeah.
Um, I would much rather be in my boots, with my rain gear on, freezing my butt off, you know, and helping these guys out in that way than being in my office and like, here's a handout,
Mm-hmm.
uh, why you should eat more vegetables, right? Like that's
Yeah.
just not
Mm-hmm.
how it works in the tactical field.
Yeah.
It's performance focused, and usually these guys are going to be focused on two primary aspects, just depending on where in their career they're at, right? So you have the performance aspect, but then you also have that longevity aspect, right? I'm at the beginning of my career, and I just want to put out and be the best that I can be and at the top of my game. And there's other things I want to do with my career, and in order to do that, I need to be a physical specimen.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get, like mid-career, end of career guys that are like, I still want to perform, but I also am very aware of my own mortality
Yeah.
and of how much different I feel here now at 40 than I did when I was 25. And I want to extend the quality and the quantity of the years that I live, right? And so those are two very big aspects of my job, is helping guys perform top level, helping them perform top level through the duration of their career, oftentimes in a low resource situation, and how can we get them living longer and just living better?
Mm-hmm.
That's it. You know,
So
that's
knowing,
that's
okay.
typically what I do.
Yeah,
Yeah. Hmm.
knowing that you have these two archetypes, kind of, and it's probably going to be an oversimplification, but for our purposes, I think that's totally fine. You're looking at these two archetypes for the young, working his way up through selection, becoming a physical specimen, trying to make a name for himself in the field, become a valued member of his team. What are the things that these guys require the most help with? I'm assuming a big one is probably eating enough. Um, do you help with things like, how do they handle MREs? I know in some instances they only get a certain amount of food at a certain time. Like, how do you guide these guys who are looking for peak performance through the difficulties that may become present, I don't know, in their job and in that role? So, first archetype, the young kid. What are the most common things you see yourself working through with them in the field?
Yeah. So, I mean, you hit it spot on. So, low energy availability is a huge factor with these guys. And every unit is different, right? Even within special operations, each unit has its own personality and its own vibe. And, it, you know, these guys are always wanting to be at the top of their game. And it's very easy, right? In the Gen Pop, you sometimes hear that you can't outwork your nutrition. But in the special operations community, if you're at a unit where the culture and the environment is to do the work day in and day out at the top level, absolutely, they have the ability to outwork their calories on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And what we see a lot of times is these young guys that are coming in 19, 20, 22, 24, right? Their age, their youth protects them a little bit until it doesn't,
Yeah.
and so they'll come in with erratic eating patterns, not eating anything before they train, maybe getting breakfast after they train, probably skipping lunch, surviving off energy drinks and who knows what else during the day, caffeine,
Mm-hmm.
um, you know probably going to eat dinner, most likely to eat dinner probably out, um, and then there will be this situation where they're maybe taking in an excessive amount of poor calories or nutrient poor food throughout the night till they go to bed. And
Mm-hmm.
then we also can't ignore the fact that there's probably some alcohol involved as well,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have these irregular eating patterns that are not supporting physical performance, and it's not because they don't care, it's because they don't know, but also there's like a social aspect to
Yeah.
that, within the community. And because they're still performing really well, they don't really see the importance of managing their nutrition or some of those other lifestyle variables
Mm-hmm.
that are going to matter to them in 10, 15 years when they're a little bit older
Yeah.
and things aren't working as well as they used to. And so that's kind of what we see in the younger population is they just don't have the knowledge, and we really focus on just educating them and then just really understanding like what's important to them,
Mm-hmm.
you know and some of these guys, they want to go on to do even more with their career, and being able to educate them and show them, hey, this is how nutrition can make you faster, stronger,
Yeah.
maybe even look a little bit better.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have to be forward thinking and think about how it's going to affect your hormone levels, your recovery.
Yeah.
If you are trying to stay in this organization for a certain amount of time, how can we make sure that you aren't falling apart
Yeah.
in a few years?
Yeah. I
Your
think
employees in that way.
that's a really good point. I mean, I see it in athletics, obviously not to that extreme, but you have these young men and women who they can get away with a lot. They can get away with a lot of dumb stuff. And like, it's not because they're dumb, it's just because it's working. So they haven't had to go through the rabbit hole of trying to figure it out. So I end up working with a lot of people who are 30 plus, 35
Mm-hmm.
plus, because they've hit that wall, either because they have children now, their lifestyle has changed, things have just slowed down enough, or they now have an injury or an ache and a pain. Um, but for the younger crowd, I think it's so important to talk about low energy availability and the ways that can just slowly eat away at their ability to recover. Um, in pretty nefarious ways when you're looking at things like bone regrowth, tendon strength, lean muscle mass, and just hormone levels. There's just so many things that can kind of just slowly tank after an extended period of time in low energy availability. And I think for men, unfortunately, they don't have the signal of losing their monthly cycle that women have. Um, where, with women, it becomes pretty apparent when we're in amenorrhea. Like we lose our cycle. Um, Things are clearly just they're not working as well. And I think for men, they can kind of just disguise it. They can just they don't, they don't notice the big warning sign because there isn't one. They can just keep going. And this obviously isn't speaking for everyone. Everyone's different, but I think there's
And
always,
I think there's also
yeah,
the stigma around admitting that you don't feel good.
yeah, especially in the military, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so, what we'll see sometimes with the older gentlemen or those who are a little bit later in their careers, they get into the situation where they experience, just allostatic overload,
Hmm.
right? And so, sometimes it's nutrition related, sometimes it's nutrition and stress related, and it, there's just lots of variables there.
Hmm.
And so we see the situation where they've been in a state of low energy availability for a long time, where they're undergoing some pretty severe psychological and physiological stress, sometimes self-inflicted, and where there's just not enough thought given to the recovery process. And what happens is the body systems, and you're probably familiar with this, is they sometimes just quit working the way that we want them to work,
Yeah.
right? Cortisol levels are too high, testosterone levels are too low. Eventually cortisol bottoms out, and now we're just in this state of chronic fatigue, and now we can't control our blood sugar. Now our lipids are all over the place. I
Hmm.
have brain fog, I can't remember anything, and then compounding that, the nutrition, the stress, the lifestyle. Now you have physical injury from concussion, TBI,
Hmm.
overpressure injuries, right? And in the military, we take all these precautions to protect against those things. But when you're talking about guys who are, on the range, you know, uh, more often than not, who are being exposed to environmental things. We don't use lead in our munitions anymore, but some of these ranges are decades old and there's still lead contaminants on those ranges,
Hmm.
right? And so this just contributes to that. We have situations where you have shearing forces, you have gases from munitions, you're out in the heat, you're out there. There's just so many compounding factors for guys who are later in their career, and so part of my job is to make sure that we're setting them up for success by making sure that their systems are working properly, as much as we can. Are we feeding you enough calories? Are you getting enough protein? What are we doing supplement wise to support your immune system and your body's natural detoxification process? And how are we trying to look ahead to be proactive about what could potentially happen in the future, and um, how do we kind of stop that from happening, or how do we prolong the onset of chronic diseases? And
Hmm.
so for the older guys, that's a big thing. And again, like, I think their sense of mortality, like once it kicks in, like they really buy into that as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah.
They understand that nutrition is a big piece of that.
Hmm. So when you talk about these nutritional interventions and these supplements as sort of like protective agents, we're not to the point where we're trying to fix anything necessarily, but are there a handful that you just recommend to guys as more of a preventative measure or a protective measure? Um, and then obviously when you're dealing with, and this could be two different questions, but the first one, talking about supplements, talking about um, obviously like helping their system purge heavy metals and things like that. And then the second part of the question, which would be how do we help these guys eat enough, or how do we help them adjust their lifestyle while still being able to roll with a schedule they probably can't control most of the time, and then being able to socialize and still feel like a part of the team.
Yeah, so this is a community where food first is not always going to be feasible or work for them.
Hmm.
um, from a demanding schedule standpoint, but also depending on where they are in the world at any given time, they may not have access to quality food or food in general.
Yeah.
And, so supplementation is a big part of what I do. And so there's going to be a few that I recommend no matter what. A multivitamin for sure is going to be one of those things. And the reason for this, because I know there's always like, do you need a vitamin? Do you not need a multivitamin? But in this population, you absolutely do. One of the things we know is that the tactical population, and not just the military, but anybody who works alongside environmental hazards, who has a lot of physiological stress, they're typically going to go through their vitamin and micronutrient stores at a higher rate than the average civilian is, who's not exposed to some of the things that they're exposed to. The International Society of Sports Nutrition actually put out a position paper a couple years ago regarding the tactical athlete. And part of what they put out is that all tactical athletes, fire, police officers, military should be taking a multivitamin for those reasons, but also just because food quality has gone down. And we know this, right? So the quality has gone down. So a multivitamin always. The other one that's going to be that I'm typically going to recommend is also going to be a fish oil supplement.
Hmm.
Now, the recommendation here for the Gen Pop on dosage is, I believe, 1 gram per day. For the tactical population, we're going to recommend 3 to 4 grams per day. And under a doctor's supervision in a post concussive situation, we may recommend as high as 7 to 9 grams per day during that recovery period. Since we're along the lines of concussion, when we're looking at like mild TBI and concussion prophylactics, creatine monohydrate is now one that's being promoted as something that tactical athletes can take to help protect the brain. And so, roughly 3 to 5 grams per day is going to be recommended across the board for
Hmm.
anybody who is a tactical athlete, right? Not only from a protective standpoint, but then in a post injury situation, uh, this is a complementary medicine or complementary supplement, sorry, that is now being used pretty extensively for
Hmm.
treatment. So those two I think are really important in this population because we know that when somebody's had a lot of head trauma, a lot of concussion, sometimes undiagnosed, that this can lead to downstream issues with hormone production,
Hmm.
right? Amongst other things, moods, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation has all been linked to head injury.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to protect the brain. Another one that I'm recommending to just about everybody is magnesium bisglycinate as well.
Okay.
Um, because it plays a role in so many metabolic reactions in the body. Most people are deficient, they have no idea. And a lot of our tactical athletes are deficient in vitamin D. So when they're mega dosing vitamin D to get their levels back up, you have to have additional magnesium as well in order to properly synthesize vitamin D.
Yeah.
And so those are typically going to be my top ones that I recommend across the board for anybody working in the tactical space. Um, when we look at supporting like the body's natural detoxification systems or some of those late career things that we're trying to mitigate, typically I'm going to recommend that in order to supplement beyond that, we'll usually do some biomarker testing,
Yeah.
right? Like let's look at what's happening with the thyroid, the hormones. Let's test your iron, your B12, your RBC, magnesium, zinc, all that stuff. And then, we can make specific recommendations based on what your body's actually doing.
Yeah. And I'm sure, after you run those tests, you can also see things like, is there an absorption issue? Are you dealing with, is dietary supplementation even going to work? because especially with things like vitamin B variants and then different types of anemia. There's different treatment methods for that. Anemia can cause low thyroid, or thyroid can cause anemia. Like there's just a bunch of things that can unhelpfully help each other in making someone's life miserable.
Yeah.
So I agree with you. One of the first things I do with people when they're asking like what supplements should I take is, okay, here's a group of safe ones, but if you want to get more specific, you have to get a blood test. You have to get a full metabolic panel. You have to get these blood tests done, um, because you could be thinking, oh, I have low energy, I have low vitamin D, I have all these things. And you might have high vitamin D, you might have, low other things that contraindicate the supplement that you're taking because you think like there's just a bunch of stuff that could
Mhm.
happen. So I'm obviously you recommend that, but I always think it's so important to reiterate that, like, just go get, please get a blood test. Um,
Yeah. And it's so accessible now,
yes.
like sometimes, and a lot of people don't know this, a lot of times your insurance will dictate, what your doctor can and can't do,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so it's not always that your doctor is being difficult, although of course there are some. Um, but you have to really be invested and you have to be willing to seek out your own answers sometimes. And so now what we're seeing is that you as a consumer, if can go out and get the lab testing done,
Hmm.
right? So you have like coaches where you can get the lab testing done for you. Myself, for instance, I will typically facilitate that for my clients.
Hmm.
But even if you don't have a coach, you can go to Quest Labs, you can go to LabCorp, you can go to all these places, and you can order your own labs. And so, I think it's important that if you're approaching the age of 30 and you haven't had a full lab panel
Hmm.
done, like you are just willfully ignorant about what's happening within your body. And so don't be surprised when you hit 60 and you're falling apart,
Yeah.
right?
And I too, to
Um,
that point, like we always talk about, oh, your levels will drop, things will change. But if you don't have any idea of what you look like as a healthy individual,
mhm,
you're trapped operating out of norms, out of normal ranges for a normal population. But if you're an individual who's always had just really high testosterone naturally, if you come in with a testosterone of like 500, they might be like, we're not going to supplement. We're not going to look at this. Your testosterone's
mhm,
fine. But if you've cruised your whole life up until that point between 1,000 and whatever, naturally,
yeah.
you're going to feel like poop.
Yeah,
you're,
absolutely.
you're going to feel like poop. So, like, but you're going to have normal levels according to averages. So I think it's also really important to get that picture of yourself at full health with no problems. Everything's firing perfectly. Get those blood tests done. That way, when you start to feel crappy, it's much easier to isolate the biggest issue or the biggest variable that's shifted off from center. Um,
Mhm.
that was always the frustrating thing for me dealing with chronic disease was like I would go get blood work done and they'd be like, well, everything's normal. Everything's normal. Everything's normal. But like literally everything that was possible to be at the low end was like 1 point off,
Yep.
1 point off. And I was like, well, I'm not super sick, but I don't feel good.
Yep.
So, how do I make this better? And then now I'm getting my blood work done and things are just boom, right in the middle of normal or like good high. And I'm like,
Yep.
okay, this was what my body was supposed to be doing when I was getting these blood tests as an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 10-year-old. And they just kept being like, oh, there's no red flag. So like the red flag is that
Yeah.
everything was like this close to being terrible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's right. It's how the medical system is set up, right? You're either sick or you're not sick.
Mhm.
But when we look at those reference ranges, right, there's quartiles there. It's
Yeah.
like where is really optimal? And it's, some of the things that we have to remember is that when it comes to chronic disease and to feeling just bad in general and things are starting to come up, short of like an accident or immediate injury that's like, where the effect is immediate, like you break your leg, somebody
Hmm.
hits you with their car.
Yeah.
Like if you pop up with low T, barring any inborn error of metabolism or anything like that, or uh, terrible cholesterol, and now you have cardiovascular disease or diabetes, there's like a really good chance that that started 15 years ago,
Hmm.
right? And the issue is that if you're in that normal range, but at the high end or the low end, or depending on the test, we don't do anything about it. We wait until you're sick,
Hmm. You
right?
wait until there's an acute symptom that needs to be
Hmm.
treated, which
Yeah.
I can understand from the standpoint of like the medicine world. It's very difficult to do lifestyle treatment with people unless the person is very invested. Um, but
Hmm.
at the same time, it's super limiting because the way that the whole system is constructed is that we're looking for these big red flags and these big issues rather than looking, like you said, preventative down the line. You're working with a perfectly healthy young man who's, just diving into his career, peak fitness, total physical specimen. In his mind, he's like, I'm invincible. We've all had that. Like, well, not me personally, but like, I'm invincible. I can do this. And then you don't want that to come crashing down on them one day. You want them to kind of
Mhm.
just stay aware. So we've covered the supplement portion, but especially for this high performance archetype, and I'm sure this carries over into the longevity sort of archetype, but um, how do you encourage these guys to eat enough in situations where it's difficult? Do you recommend higher fat? Do you recommend protein shakes? Obviously this is so individual, but like if someone came up to you and they're like, I'm struggling to eat enough calories, what's the first thing you typically recommend?
Yeah, it'll be a little bit situation dependent, but in a standard environment, right? Well, so we'll say non-deployed, non-training, non-school, just um, they're in there day in, day out, doing their physical training, doing their jobs, still at their local station. I will tell you that interestingly enough, I would say that probably 85% or more of the people that I work with are still not getting enough protein in general.
Yeah.
And so this is an easy one that we typically start with, right? Because when you're working with a bunch of men, an easy win is to tell them to eat more meat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, oh, I can eat more meat. Oh, done deal,
Yeah.
right? And so, where this becomes important is getting them to understand, hey, it's not just about muscle recovery, muscle maintenance, muscle growth, right? It's about your bone health.
Hmm.
Musculoskeletal injuries are a huge problem in the tactical population, and a huge burden on the military, on the healthcare system, right? And then also when you're in a high performance environment and you're working with an extreme high performer and they get into a situation where they've experienced low energy availability, low intake for a long enough amount of time, and they're not getting enough protein, and then they have a catastrophic injury,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
That's really a huge mental, um, pardon my language, mind fuck for these guys.
Yeah.
And so anything that we can do to keep their bones healthy, their tissue healthy, right, is always going to be a win.
Yeah.
And, so usually one of the things to make it also easy for them to understand the timing and of their nutrition, and what I found just from experience is sometimes if I just get them to focus on one thing, other things start to gradually fall into place
Yeah.
because they also just don't have the bandwidth to make huge changes.
Right. And also that
Um, so,
their schedule might change, day to day to day. So
yes.
like even if they have a perfect plan, their their day won't go perfectly. So the perfect plan becomes useless. So like you said, it's almost better to
Yeah.
just single intervention, let them nail that, and then everything else typically just starts to naturally fall into place around it.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
I love your
So
point
that's a
about
big one,
protein.
protein.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, we get them, hey, shooting for roughly a gram per pound of body weight, right? If we can get it in 3 to 4 settings a day, great. Let's space it out a little bit. The bigger picture being just, can you, hit that target, on a daily basis. Um, it's not necessarily that they have to get it at timed intervals perfectly every day, right? We know that that's not necessarily as important as their total daily protein intake. But what's happening when I tell them, hey, do it at 4 spaced intervals throughout the day if possible, is now they're structuring out, right? We're getting out of that irregular eating pattern of only eating once or twice a day. And now they're thinking about refueling 4 times a day versus once a day.
Yeah.
Right. And they're focusing on a high return nutrient. We're talking about meal timing now, even though we're still only talking about one thing. And then typically the next thing we'll get into is how to structure their peri-workout nutrition, pre, intra, and post. And that's where, that carbohydrate education starts to come into play.
Yeah.
And how to structure that out. And so those are the two usually first things that we're going to work on in general with these guys, because that's what they want. They want to be big, lean, strong, and they want to be faster, and like they just want to be physical specimens,
Yeah.
right? And so when they see that return on just small changes, now I'm taking in 45 grams of carbohydrates before my runs in the morning, and in as little as 2 weeks I've cut a minute and a half off my 5-mile time.
Yeah.
Right. I use that example a lot because it happens all the time, where these guys have been able to make these huge physical performance leaps in a short amount of time simply because they're taking in more calories.
Yeah.
And so that's usually where the buy-in comes from.
Yeah. It's huge, buy-in especially. So let's jump to the other archetype, the longevity group. They already have probably a lot of this wear and tear. They're maybe dealing with, I joke and I don't joke. I work with a lot of athletes who are out of the military, and sometimes I can tell that they were in the military without them even telling me by the nature of ankle, foot, lower limb, and lower back injuries that they have, and knee.
Yeah.
If they just give me a list of injuries, I usually I just know. I know that they were in the military. I just know. So, when you're working with this individual, the person who can't really run like they used to, but they still need to run. They can't really ruck like they used to, but they still need to ruck. How do you give them something to focus on and something to keep them robust, and keep them strong now that potentially they're also working against all these little injuries and niggles and age related things that they've accrued over the course of their probably pretty prolific career?
Yeah. In the older gentlemen, in the environments that I work in, the higher up the chain you go and the longer you've been around, the greater the expectation is that you don't let the young guys
Beat you.
outwork you. Beat you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And so there's this extreme high tolerance for discomfort and willingness to just push their body beyond what they should be pushing it.
Yeah.
Which is in stark contrast to the fact that as you get older, and also because you have a higher training age, you have more experience training, that minimal dosage for maximum effect is how you should be thinking, right? But there's these pervasive habits of the harder I work, the more volume I do, the harder I sweat, the better I'm going to get. And as you age and you spend longer within the tactical community, that mentality is not going to get you the things that you want long term in regards to performance, and then also just stress load on your body.
Yeah.
And so we sometimes have to do this delicate dance between helping them feel like they're still putting in the effort and that they can still perform, but also helping them to understand that more is not always more.
Yeah.
And in terms of training, and you guys know this,
Yeah.
right? And that nutrition and those other lifestyle things we do to mitigate stress, improve quality of sleep are going to be more important in the latter stages of your career than they were than you took them in the earlier stages of your career,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and for guys who are getting ready to leave the military, what often happens is you, they don't have one the support system, but then also their physicality decreases a little bit. Not everybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I've guys who are have left the military and are still just physical specimens. Um, but what can happen, right? Physical activity levels decrease.
Mm-hmm.
If you didn't really get the nutrition education before you left the military and started implementing it, your nutrition gets worse. And so all this inflammatory stress that you've accumulated during your years in the military and on the line and doing whatever you needed to do, now you're going to see that flourish, right? And by
Mm-hmm.
flourish, I mean negatively, right? We're going to see the onset of chronic disease once you leave the military.
Yeah.
And so for guys who are transitioning out, that's what we focus on. How can we make sure that you have the best quality of life on the other side of the fence, and
Mm-hmm.
so that you can still live longer? And unfortunately, sometimes it just it gets put off until the end of someone's career
Mm-hmm.
for them to start thinking about their longevity. But we do what we can to make sure that they're set up for success, whatever that might look like for the individual person.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, as a dietitian, sometimes there are going to be guys that I see day in and day out who are never going to come to me
Yeah.
for nutrition advice. Like that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
I make myself accessible. I make sure that you know who I am, but I have to be willing to accept that some people are just not going to accept my help,
Yeah.
right? For whatever reason. So you do what you can with the people who are open. One of the things that I know is that educating um, those around me, giving them my knowledge so that they can hopefully spread it to their peers by proxy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so it can work wonders, right? So if
Yeah.
I have a guy who is just like, oh, I feel a million times better after I spoke to the dietitian, I'll usually get an influx of guys who are like, oh, I spoke to so and so and this is what they told me.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that's what I have to focus on is each individual person I help is a promoter of whatever information I give them or whatever services I provide.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, now I
and
feel
so
way
sometimes,
better. Like, tell
yeah,
all your friends, please. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And so the intervention varies a little bit for everybody, but in general, it's the same.
Yeah.
Just depending on what stage of their career and life that they're in.
It's awesome. Thank you. This has
Mhm.
been really, really helpful and really awesome because obviously this is such a niche community, and I'm sure we could talk for probably 4 more hours, and I'm probably going to have you on again. Um, but from a nutritional standpoint, I feel like you've touched on a lot of things that I encounter just in the athletic community. Um, and I think, again, especially in the hybrid space, because you're dealing with individuals that want to stay big, they want to stay buff. They also want to go far, and they also want to go fast. And all of those things are necessary in the military. And then outside in sort of the hybrid performance space, those things are all like the big check marks. So you have these individuals who are especially entering into this hybrid space sport now younger, now that they know that it's a possibility. So they're entering it younger. They're getting away with a lot. And I'm still, speaking to and working with individuals 40s, 50s, and 60s who were in the military or police or fire, EMS, and trying to bring that wisdom back down to these guys who are in the early stages of their sort of fitness career. Yeah, you can get away with it now, but like imagine if you ate more. Imagine if you ate better. Imagine how good you would perform if you just did XYZ. And I think a lot of the stuff that you've brought up in this call is really good information for everybody. So thank you. That's super valuable. If people want to, I mentioned it at the start of the podcast, but if people want to find your Instagram and find your podcast and find your educational materials, where can they go to find it?
Absolutely. So on Instagram, where I spend most of my time, you can find me at tactical.dietitian.
Mhm.
I do have a podcast, and so on just about any podcasting platform, you can find it under Tactical Nutrition and Performance.
Okay.
And then, of course, I have my website, so tacticaldietitian.com. And here I have a lot of resources that are free, downloadable for guys to use to help starting to think about their nutrition. You know, what supplements should you take? You know, how can you meal plan? What if we don't want to count calories? How do I structure my nutrition then?
Mhm.
Those are all available for free on the website. So anybody can go over there and just download it.
That's awesome. I think that's so cool because there's a lot of this stuff you can get for free, but having it put together for you and curated by an individual who understands your needs helps so much because the information's out there. That's what everyone keeps saying, like, oh, well, the information's out there. And it's like, yeah, but it's out there in like 900 different forms and all of it's contradictory. And how do I know
Mhm.
what's right for me? So that's excellent. So everyone go check it out. And if you had one soundbite of advice for not just tactical athletes, but anyone pursuing fitness in general, what would that advice be? And it can be mindset, nutrition, whatever it is, but what's like the one thing you just really find yourself wanting to convey to people?
I think the first thing that comes to mind, and maybe it's because of what you just said, but the first thing that comes to mind is to ask for help to get your shit organized, right?
Yeah.
Because the reality is that, and even the guys that I work with, people know a lot. Like the internet exists. You can find information on just about anything. Now, the quality of that information might vary,
Yeah.
but where the magic of working with a coach starts to take place is when they can take your uh, I apologize, I have a foul mouth, where they can take your shit show of a life and all this information you have and they can organize it for you
Hmm.
and they can help you apply it from an objective standpoint, right?
Yeah.
And so like take Alan for instance, right? So I'm going to use a personal experience. Alan has been working with Alex for I don't even know how long now, but and he's really knowledgeable. My Alan is really knowledgeable about training and nutrition and all of these things, and he's worked with tons of coaches, but having a coach that really understood what he wanted
Yeah.
and then takes the time to provide you objective feedback and personalized programming, like the changes that we've seen in his performance have just been exponential,
He's nuts. Yeah.
since working with the right coach.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's like, what is that saying? Like, I'm going to be super cliche now. Like, if you want to go, if you, well, I don't even think it applies, right? Like, if you want to go fast alone, go alone. Like, if you want to go far and fast, then like you have to have a team,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so that's great that your internet search has taught you a lot, right?
Hmm.
But there's nothing that's going to replace the experience and the knowledge that you can get from working with a coach. And so
Yeah.
you know I would say, if you're at that place where you're stuck or where you feel like you should be getting better and you're just not, this is the time that you need to take to invest in having a coach and asking for help.
Yeah. Yeah. Remove the variables. And
Hmm.
I always say one of the best parts about being a coach that I think I forget, but I'm constantly reminded of, is that sometimes the thing that I'm best at is that I've learned so much and forgotten so much that I know what to focus on.
Yeah.
and the noise doesn't really get in the way of me helping people.
Yep.
And I think when you are first learning and you're first starting your journey, you're still in that phase of learning everything and absorbing everything, and you haven't let the extra stuff drop yet. So having someone help you be like, hey, yeah, this is important, but here's what we're going to focus on instead, or here's why, um, it it can make all the difference, and it can help you just make leaps and bounds forward towards the goal that you're looking for, without all those little snags and hangups of you worrying about, okay, well, what about this thing? What about that thing? And should I do this? And should I do that? And it's like, no, focus on one thing, do it really, really well. And typically everything else falls into
Yep.
place.
That seems to be a theme.
Yes. No, that's awesome. Well, thank you so much. I would love to have you on again if you have the time. Everyone, please check out Susan. Susan, thank you so much. Um, and yeah, it's been super awesome having you and Alan in our lives and in CHP. So just thank you for everything, all the value that both of you bring to the space, and just the idea that someone like Alan can move that fast is pretty nuts. So pretty nuts,
Yeah,
gotta say.
he's a tank.
Yes.
Uh, yeah, I'll definitely brag about him a little bit. He's got a crazy work ethic, and the programming is just so phenomenal. So we're just so grateful. Um, and I'll say this one last thing, right? Like you said, I'll probably just keep talking, but I just have to say this one last thing. On the longevity piece is, he's no spring chicken, right?
Yeah.
When you're approaching 40 and you're outperforming guys that are 10, 15 years younger than you, that says a lot about him as an athlete, but also about, the programming from Alex. And so we're super grateful. And I'm super humbled that you invited me on, and I would love to chat again.
Okay.
This has just been phenomenal. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, I think there's just so much cool stuff we could discuss, just outside of the realm of nutrition. So let's pin in it. We'll talk again. And I'm sure everyone will enjoy listening to that conversation as well. So thank you. I'm just going to hit
You bet.
stop.